This is Craig with Carsalton Advisory, and today we're going to go through the Objective 3.1 practice tasks for the 2016 Microsoft Excel Expert Examination Study Guide. Let's get started. The first thing we're required to do is open up the Excel Expert 3.1 from our download files. What they've asked us to do now is to calculate the gross margin in the range from H7 to H14. Now, a bit of a confession here. What they've asked us to do is not actually called gross margin. This is a markup calculation. But they've specified it being done this way, and they've called it a gross margin, so we'll stick with that. So what we need to do is to take calculate the gross margin by subtracting cost from retail. So our cost is column E. So I'm going to start off with G7, which is our retail price, and then we're going to subtract the cost column, E7, from that value. Last, we need to divide that by column E7, which is the cost. Now, when I hit enter, you're going to see a couple things happen. First off, all of the cell values are going to get filled in. And that's because we've done this inside an active Excel table. So when we type a formula into one cell, it continues it all the way down. The second thing you'll notice are these pound div 0 figures. So these are to show us that there is a mathematical error and that our calculation is trying to divide a number by 0, which, if you remember from your math classes, gives you an impossible and irrational number. So what we're tasked with is to use an if function in order to prevent this from happening. A lot of times what will happen is if you have a formula that is, for example, let's say if we wanted to sum all of these gross margins, we could go sum, select all of these gross margins, and hit enter, and all of a sudden we have an error here because of these div zeros. And so that can follow through an entire workbook if you're not careful. So we're going to use the if statement to preclude that from happening. So let's go back into this first formula. So what we want to do is start with an if statement. And then the first part of our if statement is the logical test. So what we're going to say is that if our cost, which is column E, is greater than 0, we know we won't get a 0 in our denominator and cause us issues. We can leave our formula as before because it's only going to process, Excel is only going to calculate this formula if E7 is greater than 0. Next, we want to give it a value if false. So Excel gives us a little clue at the bottom here. So they've asked us if it's false for it to say cost is 0. So now when I hit enter, this formula should get copied all the way through our table column. And you'll notice our ugly div zeros are gone, and our little test sum function is now working and giving us a value. So I've used these formulas before, and in the value of false, I've just put it sometimes as 0 or a blank in there. By having cost is 0, one benefit to that is that, ideally, I'd expect in most retail operations, you wouldn't actually have a 0 cost on an item. And so that would act as somewhat of a flag to whoever's responsible for inputting that data to get it corrected. Now proper design would preclude a cost 0 being entered into the system in the first place, but this is a reasonable double check. All right, so let's move on to the next task. All right, next they'd like us to go on to the inventory worksheet. We'll hit Control Page down to do that. And this is a little bit more involved formula. So they would like us to put a formula in cell G1, which is the top row here, that uses a SUMIFS, notice the plural, function to sum the quantity on hand range for products with a product name value that includes soup and a quantity on hold value of 0. So we have three ranges to think about in this one. First off is the quantity on hand. So this is what we want to sum up. However, we only want to sum up this category if two things happen. One, in column A, if there's a soup in the name, and in column on C, a quantity on hold value of 0. So unless both things happen, we are not going to have the values summed for us. So let's start breaking down this formula. So we'll start with an equals, SUMIF, and S. You'll notice that our auto entry has started to fill in there. So I'm just going to hit Tab to finalize that. Now, Excel does give us some help. So the first thing it tells us is we need to enter the sum range. So according to our directions, the sum range is going to be the quantity on hand, which is column D. So I'll click in column D here. I'm going to Control-Shift down to the bottom. And then what I want to do is make this an absolute reference. So I'm going to hit F4 in order to make this an absolute reference. When that's done, I'll hit my comma, and you'll notice now Excel has told me that, okay, now we're going to work on the criteria range number 1. So criteria is the section of the worksheet that we're going to evaluate. So in this case, we're going to evaluate the product name column. So I'm going to click into column A. I'm going to Control-Shift to the bottom of the column so it's all selected, and hit F4 to lock it in as an absolute reference. Next, I have to give it the criteria that we're going to use when we're going to add the values in column D. So this is going to be if there's soup in the name. So in order to do that, I'm going to start with a double quotation mark. I'm going to use the ampersand or the star, asterisk, excuse me, for letting Excel know that it's a wild card, meaning that anything could be for soup as long as soup is there. Now I'm going to have to do another asterisk at the end to let it know that there could be anything afterwards after it says soup, and another quotation mark. So that is our first criteria range. Now what SUMIFS allows us to do is have multiple criteria. If you've used SUMIF in the past, that's only a single criteria that Excel evaluates. In this case, we can have multiple. For this problem, there's 2 of them, but we could continue on if we wanted to. So the second range that we're going to evaluate is the quantity on hold range. So that is column C. I'll click into column C. I'll Control-Shift to the bottom and hit F4 to lock that in as an absolute reference. I'll type in a comma to complete that term of the syntax, and now we have to have the criteria. So in this case, our directions state that the criteria is a value of 0. So I'll put my quotation mark, and then the criteria equals 0, quotation mark. So that should be the entirety of our formula. I'm going to close this off with a parenthesis at the end, and we'll hit enter and see if it works. Excellent. We have a value of 55. Now, again, to reconfirm here, Excel is only including values in which case there's a soup in the name. So let's take a quick peek here. All right, so here's one with soup. Quantity on hold is 0. Value is 25. At the bottom, there's also one that's soup. Quantity on hold 0. So both of them satisfy both criteria, and it's 30. If I add those two together, we have 55. And I don't see anything else with soup in the name. So I'm confident that we've got the right value here. Thanks for following along. Make sure to subscribe so you know when we get the next training video up, and provide a thumbs up if you think this has been a worthwhile use of your study time. Thanks for watching. This is Craig with Carshalton Advisory.